The elevator doors slid open with a muted chime, and I stepped into the glass-lined hallway of Halden Industries' top floor. My badge still worked, though by the way the receptionist avoided my eyes, I sensed it wouldn't for long. They had called me up here with no agenda, no courtesy, just a summons. The boardroom doors were already ajar. Inside, the skyline of Manhattan stretched behind Brenner Caldwell, who lounged at the head of the table like a man playing king. He was in his late 40s, younger than me, with the kind of smug confidence that came from privilege rather than grit. As soon as I entered, his lips curved into a smirk I had come to dread. "Camilla," he drawled, as if the name itself were a nuisance. "You're finished." The words landed with the weight of a gavel. Around the polished mahogany table, executives shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. I felt the burn of humiliation climb my neck, but I kept my face still, refusing to give him satisfaction. Brenner slid a stack of papers across the table with a flick of his wrist. "Sign these exit papers. Standard procedure." My hands trembled at first, but not from fear. For months I had anticipated this moment, rehearsed it, even quietly, methodically. I pulled a pen from my jacket pocket. On the last page, just beneath the lines he was so eager for me to sign, I inserted a clause I had drafted long ago, one that preserved my intellectual property rights to every compliance system I had designed. The pen glided smoothly. Brenner leaned back, smug, certain of his victory. He didn't notice the additional lines, didn't care enough to read closely. His arrogance was my shield. When I set the pen down, silence filled the room. A few colleagues glanced at me, eyes darting from the papers to my face. They knew something had shifted, though they couldn't quite see what. No one spoke. I gathered my box of belongings, framed photos, notebooks, the small brass clock I kept by my desk, and walked toward the door. Behind me, Brenner let out a low chuckle. The kind men reserve for battles they think they've won. I didn't look back. My steps were steady, each one carrying me closer to the moment I had been preparing for. The smirk on Brenner Caldwell's face followed me out of the boardroom, but so did the signature that would one day erase it. The subway ride back to Brooklyn Heights felt longer than usual, though the train screeched along its rails at the same unrelenting pace. When I reached my apartment, I unlocked the door and stepped inside with the box still cradled in my arms. The walls seemed to close in on me, absorbing the weight of humiliation I carried. I set the box down on the small dining table and stood there, staring at it as if the contents could explain how 17 years of my life had been reduced to cardboard and silence. One by one, I unpacked the remnants of my career. A photograph of the compliance team from a decade ago, smiling despite the endless deadlines. A stack of notebooks filled with diagrams and lines of code scribbled during late-night brainstorms. The brass clock Brenner had once mocked, saying it ticked louder than my voice during meetings. Each item was a reminder of nights spent hunched over my laptop while the city outside celebrated without me. Images flooded back Christmas dinners missed because regulators were breathing down our necks. Birthdays replaced with coffee-fueled audits. Hospital visits skipped when my mother was ill because the company couldn't manage without me. I had believed my sacrifices were investments in loyalty, in security. Today proved they were nothing more than wasted offerings at the altar of corporate arrogance. 17 years, erased with a smirk. I replayed the boardroom in my mind, Brenner's careless tone, the way the executives avoided my eyes, the scrape of papers across the table, and then me steady, calm, signing without protest. At the time, it must have looked like surrender, but I knew better. That calm wasn't resignation. It was resolve. I crossed to my bookshelf and retrieved my old laptop, the one I had refused to discard even when the company issued me a newer model. I powered it up, waiting for the familiar hum. Years ago, against Brenner's wishes, I had archived copies of every contract I touched. He had called it paranoia. I had called it prudence. Tonight, prudence was about to become my sharpest weapon. As the screen flickered to life, I opened the folder marked Legacy Files. My fingers hovered over the mouse, ready to unearth the words that could turn silence into thunder. The glow of the laptop bathed my small home office in a pale light, the rest of the apartment quiet as the city outside drifted towards sleep. Papers were scattered across the desk, old contracts, regulatory filings, compliance manuals I had carried home over the years. My eyes moved quickly but carefully, scanning lines I knew almost by heart. I wasn't searching for reassurance. I was hunting for proof. Hours slipped by unnoticed, until a single paragraph stopped me cold. The highlighted section pulsed on the screen like a heartbeat. All proprietary compliance systems and frameworks designed by senior compliance architect Camila Rios remain her intellectual property. Any operation, modification, or sale requires her explicit written authorization. I leaned back, letting the words sink in. My breath caught in my chest, the weight of it pressing against every memory of Brenner's arrogance. This wasn't paranoia. It was power. I clicked to the signature page. There, in the same impatient scrawl I had seen 1,000 times, was Brenner Caldwell's name. I remembered the day clearly during a frantic acquisition. He had waved away my explanation, calling the addendum legal fluff as he scribbled his initials and rushed off to a dinner reservation. He hadn't cared then? He should have. A quiet laugh escaped me, sharp and edged with something darker. "You signed your own ruin," I whispered, the words tasting like steel. The exhaustion that had gripped me earlier evaporated. My hands steadied as I began drafting a notice addressed to Halden's third-party compliance vendor. The language was precise, irrefutable, effective immediately. All operations of Halden's compliance infrastructure were frozen until written authorization was granted by me, the rightful intellectual property holder. I read it twice, then 3 times, ensuring every word carried the weight of law. My cursor hovered over the send button. For 17 years, I had given them everything: my time, my loyalty, my silence. Tonight, I would give them something else: consequences. With a steady breath, I pressed send. The notice vanished into the ether, bound for inboxes that would erupt by morning. For the first time in years, I felt something close to peace, though I knew what I had just unleashed would not be quiet. By the next morning, my phone lit up with headlines. Halden Industries halts transactions due to technical issues. Stock dips 3% in early trading. I knew it was no glitch. It was the ripple of my notice finally reaching their walls. Inside the glass tower on Wall Street, chaos had replaced Brenner's smug calm. Servers rejected logins, access codes failed, and every outgoing transaction triggered red alerts. The compliance software I had architected once their proudest boast to investors had become their prison. Reports piled up on the executives' desks. In less than 24 hours, nearly $2.8 billion in pending deals were locked in limbo. International clients screamed over conference calls, regulators demanded answers, and traders hammered their phones as the stock price slid lower. The empire I had built for them now stood frozen, every pathway blocked by the key Brenner had thrown away when he dismissed me. I could almost picture the boardroom, Brenner pacing, his voice rising as he barked orders. "Get it in here now. Restart the servers." But the IT staff, pale and sweating, would tell him what I already knew: nothing was wrong with the systems. They were functioning exactly as designed. Without my digital authorization, not a single deal could move forward. Executives whispered in corners, some daring to glance at the headlines scrolling across television screens. Halden faces operational paralysis. Panic rippled through every floor of the building, from the trading desk to the legal department. For the first time, Brenner Caldwell's signature smirk faltered. The board convened an emergency meeting, demanding explanations he couldn't give. His charm and bravado, once his shield, cracked under the pressure. When IT insisted the system required my key, Brenner waved them off with a sneer. "She's gone. Fix it." But they couldn't. The reality sank deeper with every passing hour. I was no longer in their offices, no longer part of their empire, yet every dollar, every deal, every shred of their credibility still passed through the framework I had designed. I had become the absence they couldn't afford, and the silence they couldn't override. And by midnight, that silence would drive Brenner to call me himself. The apartment was quiet except for the ticking of the brass clock I'd rescued from my desk. I had just begun to drift when my phone buzzed across the nightstand, the vibration sharp in the stillness. The name on the screen made me sit upright. Brenner Caldwell. I let it ring once, twice, before I answered. His voice was nothing like the one that had smirked me out of the boardroom. It trembled, strained. "Camilla, listen, we need you." I said nothing, waiting. He rushed on, the desperation leaking through every syllable. "You'll get your job back, double your salary, bonuses. I'll issue a public apology, in writing if you want. Just, please, release the system." Still, I stayed silent, the weight of his begging hanging in the room. I wanted him to hear the sound of my breathing, the control he no longer had. Hours later, the pounding on my door startled me. When I opened it, Alden Frost, Brenner's private attorney, stepped in with the confidence of a man who thought the law bent to his will. His suit was immaculate, his smile sharp. "Camilla," he began smoothly, "you've made your point, but unless you reverse this stunt, you'll face lawsuits, breach of duty, corporate sabotage, you name it." I gestured toward the table where my laptop sat open, the clause highlighted on the screen. "Read." He leaned over, eyes skimming the lines, then the signatures. For a moment, his mask slipped. He cleared his throat. "This clause, it's unusually broad, but even so, you just confirmed my ownership." I cut in, leaning closer. "Shall I record you?" Color drained from his face. His practiced arrogance cracked, replaced by the unmistakable panic of a man who realized he'd been cornered by his own words. I closed the laptop with deliberate calm. "Tell Brenner this isn't a negotiation. It's enforcement." Alden left without another threat. Minutes later, Brenner called again, voice breaking now. "Camilla, please." I ended the call before he could finish. For years, they had drowned out my voice with smirks and dismissals. Tonight, my silence was louder than all of them. And in that silence, my thoughts drifted back to the years I had sacrificed for them. The morning after Brenner's pleas, I walked to Prospect Park, needing air that wasn't saturated with his desperation. The trees were just beginning to bud, fragile green against the gray of early spring. I sat on a bench overlooking the lake, and for the first time in years, let myself drift back. There had been a time when I nearly left Halden. I was younger then, still restless, still believing in the dream of building something of my own. I had drawn up a business plan for a compliant startup, lean, innovative, uncompromising. I can still remember the thrill of running my finger down the columns of projected revenue, imagining freedom written in numbers. But the board had found out. They cornered me in a conference room, voices urgent, smiles rehearsed. "Stay with us." "Camilla," they'd urged. "We'll give you equity, draft whatever protections you need. Just don't walk away." I should have. My gut told me so, but I stayed, convincing myself I was securing stability, that the clauses I drafted were a kind of armor. I never realized they were also a blade. Now, sitting in Prospect Park, I understood. Those signatures, their eagerness to keep me bound, had armed me with the weapon I wielded today. My so-called armor had turned into their trap. I closed my eyes, listening to the faint laughter of children on bicycles. Images rose unbidden, my son's birthday candles extinguished without me there. My mother's voice over the phone as she told me her test results while I sat in an endless meeting. My friends' messages left unanswered on holidays because a regulator had called. I had given Halden the best years of my life, and they had thanked me with a smirk and a dismissal. For years, I thought survival was enough, enduring, outlasting, but now I realized survival was too small a prize. I wasn't meant to crawl away from Brenner's arrogance, I was meant to dismantle it. The park's wind carried the faint scent of damp earth, and I breathed it in as if it could steady me. I stood, straightening my coat, my resolve sharper than ever, and when I returned home, I prepared to walk back into their boardroom, this time holding every card. The Halden boardroom looked different this time. The air was thick with panic, the chatter of directors sharp and anxious. Stock had fallen 17% in 2 days, and rumors of regulatory probes were crawling across every financial network. Brenner stood at the head of the table, tie loosened, sweat gathering at his temples. For once, his smirk was nowhere to be found. I pushed the doors open without invitation, conversations cut off mid-sentence, eyes turning toward me in a mixture of shock and recognition. I walked calmly to the table, setting a folder down with deliberate precision. "Camilla!" Brenner barked, his voice cracking at the edges. "This is a private meeting." "No," I said evenly. "This is my meeting because every deal you can't close, every transaction stuck in limbo, runs through the systems I built. And you signed away control the day you signed these?" I slid the documents across the table. Pages rustled as board members leaned forward, scanning the highlighted clause. The language was unambiguous, my rights undeniable. "You fired me." I continued, my tone steady. "And with that, you terminated your own access." Gasps rippled through the room. A few directors whispered to each other, eyes widening as they realized the magnitude. Brenner's face drained of color. He lunged for bluster, as always. "She's bluffing. This is a stunt." I lifted another set of papers, thicker this time. "Do you want me to bluff about these too?" The room fell silent. I laid out audits I had compiled years ago, records of concealed financial misstatements Brenner had buried under layers of false reporting. I had flagged them once, quietly, but he had laughed them off and told me to keep the regulators happy. Now, those same buried truths stared back at him under fluorescent light. The board members bent over the pages, expressions shifting from disbelief to fury. A director at the far end of the table muttered, "God help us!" Brenner's hands shook as he shoved the papers away, his voice reduced to a hoarse whisper. "You wouldn't dare." But we all knew I already had, and before the week was over, the world outside this boardroom would know it too. The ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria was ablaze with camera flashes. Reporters jostled for position, microphones extended like weapons, their voices rising above one another in a frenzy. Investors filled the back rows, their faces tight with worry, their whispers laced with panic. I slipped into a seat near the front, my presence unnoticed among the chaos. That was how I preferred it. At the podium, Brenner dabbed his forehead with a folded handkerchief. The suit that once seemed perfectly cut now hung loose. His bravado wilted under the heat of the lights. He began to speak, his voice unsteady, rattling off phrases about temporary setbacks and technical reviews. Every word was met with skeptical glares and scribbling pens. I watched in silence, hands folded in my lap. The man who had dismissed me with a smirk now struggled to string together sentences, his lies unraveling under the weight of truth. Behind him, members of the board whispered urgently among themselves, faces ashen. Then it happened. A senior director stepped to the microphone, his tone grave but resolute, effective immediately. "Brenner Caldwell has resigned as Chief Executive Officer of Halden Industries." The room erupted. Journalists shouted over each other, flashes firing in rapid bursts. Questions rained down. Was this forced? Who knew about the financial misstatements? What happens to the $2? $8 billion in frozen deals. Brenner's face twisted, caught between rage and despair. He slammed the handkerchief onto the podium and stormed toward the exit. The sea of reporters surged after him, their shouts echoing down the marble hallways. The man who had once laughed at my caution now fled under the glare of cameras, his empire collapsing in real time. I remained seated, still and quiet amid the storm. No one looked at me. No microphones were shoved in my face. That was fine. My satisfaction didn't come from the headlines or the spectacle, it came from knowing justice had arrived, not by my hand in public, but by the truth I had quietly armed years ago. When the last flashbulb dimmed, I rose and slipped out the side door. My steps were light, my resolve heavier than ever. It was time to decide whether silence was enough, or if stepping into the light would define my legacy. The office smelled faintly of fresh paint and new beginnings. It wasn't the towering glass palace of Halden Industries, but a modest suite on Broad Street in Lower Manhattan, with sunlight pouring through tall windows and a brass nameplate by the door, Rios Compliance Consulting. Clients arrived faster than I had imagined. Some were old contacts who remembered the long nights I had saved their transactions from collapse. Others were new, drawn by the headlines that had exposed Halden's disgrace. They came not for spectacle, but for integrity, the kind of steady, meticulous work I had always given, the kind that outlives arrogance. Within weeks, the board at Halden reached out. Their message was almost pitiful, an urgent request for my services. This time, there were no smirks, no dismissals. They offered retainers, public credit, complete autonomy. For once, I held every term of the contract, and they signed without hesitation. As I walked through my new office, I let myself linger on the small details. A row of framed client testimonials lined one wall. A vase of tulips brightened the reception desk. The hum of quiet conversations drifted from the conference room where my team, hand-picked, respected, and treated as equals, drafted solutions for clients who trusted us. This was what Brenner never understood. I had never wanted power for its own sake, nor revenge as a trophy. What I wanted was dignity, to be seen not as a cog, not as a background technician, but as the architect of systems that carried weight in the real world. Revenge, I realized, had been only the surface. Respect that quiet. Enduring respect was the true victory. I stood by the window, watching the city pulse below, remembering that final smirk Brenner had given me. How sure he had been that I was disposable. How certain he was that my silence meant defeat. I whispered into the glass. Not for him, not even for the world outside, but for myself. They thought I was finished, but I was the one piece they could never replace. And with that, I turned back to the work ahead. Not to settle old scores, but to build something stronger than vengeance, a legacy carved in integrity.